Today's North Korea is actually quite a paradoxical state, because despite having good prerequisites for the country's development from the very start, it's now arguably one of the poorest nations on the planet. Although, due to its location, we unfortunately have no accurate data on how bad things are there. But even in such a bad economic situation, the Hermit Kingdom still has some foreign policy ambitions, raising eyebrows of its neighbors and the entire world community, mostly due to having an atomic bomb on its territory. The Kim Dynasty, which has been in power since 1948, is to blame for this situation. So today, we're going to talk about this de facto monarchical dynasty and the way Koreans live under their leadership. As always, I would like to remind you to press the subscribe button and support the video by commenting and leaving a thumbs up. Let's start, of course, with the founder of the dynasty, Comrade Kim Il-sung, who was born under the name King Song-ju. The name by which everyone knows him was one of his two aliases he used back in his youth. The first nickname was Hanbel, the only star, and Kim Il-sung translates as the rising sun or Kim who becomes the sun. Both translations are valid. As we can see, modesty was already one of his distinguishing features at the time. To be honest, his early biography is nothing but a multi-layered mystery for us, since it's quite hard to believe in his official writings, considering how dictators tend to embellish their own early years, and even more so in North Korea. We have little information about his youth from other sources, and we don't even know where exactly he was born. Nevertheless, he is officially believed to be born on April 15, 1912, in a small village near Pyongyang in a not very wealthy family, a pure reflection of the political and social processes taking place in Korea at that time. In other words, they were a pious family of Protestants forced to flee in 1920 because of their anti-Japanese activities. What did the Japanese do in Korea at the beginning of last century? The answer is simple. After the Meiji Restoration, Japan began to grow stronger and wanted to expand its foreign policy influence, particularly in Korea. As a result, the Japanese-Chinese War from 1894 to 1895 and the well-known Russo-Japanese War took place. And that's how the Japanese ended up in Korea in the 1920s, where they established their protectorate. Later on, the whole area was annexed in August 1910, 2 years before Kim's birth. A brutal policy of cultural assimilations was carried out there, with Korea being treated more like a colony. So today, in both North and South Korea, the symbol of Imperial Japan is considered something like a swastika. That is, a representation of everything bad. The Japanese restored order with an iron fist by torturing, killing, etc. So in the interests of their own safety, many Koreans were forced to flee, including Kim's family. The next important point in his biography is his participation in an anti-Japanese union with the very original name Down with Imperialism, although Kim's official biographies note that he founded it himself, though it is very difficult to believe them, since he was only 14 years old at the time. Shortly, young Kim became more and more interested in Marxism, which was a rather popular philosophical trend around the world back then. Kim Il-sung joined various Marxist organizations for the activities of which he even went to prison at some point, only to be released in a few months. After that, in 1931, he joined the Communist Party of China and participated in anti-Japanese actions in northern China as part of it. Apparently, he was not bad at doing his part of the job, since he even managed to gain the support of one of the influential communists, who was personally connected with Mao Zedong. Again, keep in mind that the info from his official biography could be slightly exaggerated. Still, his accomplishments shouldn't be denied either, of course. To consolidate everything he has achieved, he began rebranding his own image, so to speak. For example, it was at that time when he changed his name and was appointed commander of the 6th Division. A great career growth for a 24-year-old lad, isn't it? Very often, this period is romanticized in his biography, and at times it's even stated that he defeated the Japanese troops in the thousands. But this is not entirely true. Firstly, a guerrilla division was consisting of only a few hundred people. Secondly, the greatest proven achievement of his victories was a victory over a Japanese police detachment, not over a military one. Among other things, very important was his effort to establish coordination between the guerrillas in northern China and the Korean Association for the Restoration of the Fatherland, a group engaged in the struggle against the Japanese occupation, which would later be interpreted as almost a key point in Korea's liberation. In fact, these actions, as well as the efficiency shown by his group of guerrillas, brought him the glory of a pretty good commander. Moreover, it brought the attention from the Japanese authorities, who announced a hunt for Il-sung, giving him the nickname Tiger. By this time, the Second World War had already begun, and Comrade Kim was very close to being caught. Thus, he accepted an invitation from the Soviet Union and retreated to its territory, where he and his subordinates underwent training, also joining the Soviet Red Army, where he already received the rank of major and served in it until the very end of the Second World War. As you probably know, the war didn't end in victory over Nazi Germany, as there was still the Japan Empire, which remained intact. On August 7, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on it, which ended in Korea's division along the 38th parallel into occupation zones, the same way they divided Germany. The North went to the Communists, i.e., the Soviet Union, but this meant nothing yet for Kim, since at that time he was not such a well-known figure, and besides that, the Koreans already had their own leader, who together with other nationalists was able to organize temporary people's committees for the restoration of statehood in Korea. His name was Cho Man-sik, a nationalist and a convinced Christian of the Protestant orientation. The Japanese themselves didn't mind taking him as the leader in Korea, while the Koreans loved him due to him going through all these tough times together with his people, unlike Kim Il-sung, who was in China, then was hiding in the USSR. With that said, despite the ideological differences between the Soviets and Comrade Cho, they decided to let him stay in power, thinking that with further pressure, he could be forced to conform to the Union's policy. However, it soon turned out that he was too stubborn in his anti-communist beliefs due to strong religiosity and other values. Therefore, the Moscow authorities decided to look for a more obedient candidate, and that's when our main character Kim Il-sung took the spotlight. To be fair, it's not entirely clear why he was chosen in the first place. Yes, he became famous for his accomplishments as the guerrilla's commander, but there were other guerrilla leaders who stood out no less. Seems like his very strong distance from the Korean people was a decisive factor, since he hadn't been in Korea for about 26 years, speaking if not terrible, then at least poor Korean. Thus, some assume that he would be a very convenient figure that can be controlled. The USSR decided to communize North Korea with all its might and at a rapid pace, and for this purpose, the North Korean Provincial People's Committee was created and headed by, as you've probably guessed, Comrade Kim Il-sung. The guy began to bring out reforms, the most important of which was the distribution of the lands of the big landowners and their transfer to the peasants. But at the same time, the peasants were forbidden to sell their newfound property, and they also had to pay 1/4 of the entire harvest as a tax. There was also the nationalization of the entire Japanese industry. Well, the Japanese couldn't say a thing against it, and elementary general education was also introduced. The establishment of a new government also led to the fact that the same landowners, students, merchants, and other individuals not wanted by the communists began to simply leave the country, which was welcomed by the Soviets, because finally, these elements that were responsible for destabilizing the state won't stand on their path, and no one will be worried about brain drain. This is secondary. But not only the economic aspect needed to be taken care of, Comrade Kim still needed to prove his own power, since North Korea was far from a one-state party, with all the communist parties united into one. This led to many different factions now operating in the same single party, mostly divided by origin. For example, there was a party consisting of people who originated from the USSR, another party consisting of people who didn't leave the Korean peninsula at all, and also a guerrilla faction led by Kim Il-sung. Therefore, with such intra-party diversity, conflicts were inevitable, and to avoid future misunderstandings, it was necessary to carry out purges in which Comrade Kim succeeded well. At the same time, he managed to strengthen his own power by creating his own People's Army. Well, the year 1948 came, and it was then that the division of the peninsula was formally confirmed. You see, the United Nations held special elections in the southern part of Korea, the results of which declared the Republic of Korea, better known as South Korea. In response, the Soviets also held their own special election with no alternative choice to make. It wasn't any better in the south part, and on September 9, 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or DPRK, was declared, with Kim operating as Prime Minister. Since then, he began to prepare for further war with the bad capitalists and Western puppets. The methods of economic management were, of course, by Stalin's recipes, that is, centralized government and 5-year plans. Interestingly enough, within the context of an impending war, such an economy has proven itself to be much more effective, because this way, the state can make full use of a large part of the resources. But in the context of effective management in peacetime, it shows itself diversely, to say the least. You will understand it from this and from many other videos on this channel. Be sure to subscribe. So, it all went down to the Korean War, which was such an epic event that it could be made into a separate big video. So, we will cover only a few brief points here. The first thing you need to know about it is that the North Koreans were several times tougher than their southern brothers. Secondly, there was immense dissatisfaction with the South Korean government, resulting in several large pro-communist riots that were brutally suppressed. Thirdly, the initiator of this very war was not the Soviet Union or China, but Kim Il-sung himself, who dreamed of becoming the sole ruler of Korea, while Stalin declared that the Soviet army wouldn't openly enter the whole mess. Well, to avoid direct conflict with the US, and the leader will support this initiative only if Mao, the leader of China, proceeds to help the Koreans. There are different opinions on this matter, since we have memoirs of Khrushchev who wrote that China actually approved the DPRK plans, but some studies show that Mao was not too happy about them, but still supported North Korea because of the Soviets promising to help China later on. So on June 25, 1950, the Korean People's Army crossed the border with the Republic of Korea, justifying it by the fact that South Korea was actually the first to attack, not to mention the illegal government of Ri Sing-man ruling on its territory. Well, you get the picture. And when I said that North Korea was much stronger than South Korea, I was not exaggerating. After 3 days of active fighting, Seoul, the capital of South Korea, fell. The soldiers themselves were not motivated at all. It was often the case that they simply deserted or went over to the North Korean side, because firstly, no one considered the northern neighbors to be an enemy. Come on, they were a single state just a few years ago, and secondly, North Korea offered quite pleasant reforms to ordinary people. Therefore, it looked 1,000 times better than the corrupt and rotten South Korea government. There was no smell of economic boom back then. No wonder the South Korean government had to retreat to the very south, and it seemed this was the end for the land of the morning calm. Suddenly, the US came to the rescue and battled the Northerners. On October 19th of the same year, Pyongyang was already taken back, and practically the entire army of North Korea was slammed and thrown right to the border with China. After that move from the west, everything changed completely, because the PRC, the People's Republic of China, intervened in the conflict due to fears that the US could attack them too, launching a successful counterattack. As a result, a series of offensives and counteroffensives from both sides began, going back and forth in terms of seizing Seoul and Pyongyang, until the stalemate on the front line in the summer of 1953, with the active war turning into a positional one. In July of the same year, an armistice was signed and the modern border of the two Koreas was established. It's worth noting that Kim probably wanted a truce the most, because with the fact that the Chinese army was now on his territory in such massive numbers, he was afraid of losing power. And of course, his master plan and chance of uniting Korea was shattered in front of his eyes, since now the armies of the United Nations and the United States were located on the south. Next was North Korean post-war recovery, which was far from an easy process, since the country lost a huge amount of resources, people, and basically was in ruins. But at the same time, there was a plus in the form of the USSR support, which forgave all its debts and even gave new loans. Keep in mind that in the USSR at that time, many people lived almost in barracks. But sure thing, international duty was much more important than some bourgeois houses with their basic amenities. The North Korean regime coped with the struggles well, and according to some indicators, they even managed to return to the pre-war state by 1957. Kim, having lost the war he himself started, could easily lose power, and to prevent this from happening, while also of course monitoring his big brothers in the form of China and the USSR, Kim Il-sung was working on a personal cult of personality. In fact, his statues began to appear all over Korea even before the war started. But now everything was reaching a new level. Kim dealt with the economical aspect in a communist manner by having it rapidly nationalized, and in an attempt to eliminate the consequences of war in agriculture, such as lack of food and labor, a campaign of collectivization was introduced. This way, the reform that took place back in 1946 was officially abandoned. With all the land taken from the peasants, they were only left with the right to own very small plots of land, with barely enough space for subsistence. Also, the economy was mostly oriented on principles of the Soviet Union ruled by Stalin's regime, primarily focusing on the development of heavy industry and weapons, which wouldn't have a very good effect on the overall standard of living. No one thought about the light industry, just like in the Stalinist USSR. Who needs these rags, shoes, and other junk of yours? The country needs tanks and steel for them. This is what matters most. Kim continued to consolidate his own sole power, with his efforts aimed at not becoming a complete satellite of either the Chinese or the Soviets. He started to eliminate all kinds of political rivals, such as, for example, Pak Kon-yong, who was executed in 1955. But he was not the only one hidden under the rug. It's difficult to say the exact number of purges, but if thinking logically, we may assume that it was hundreds, if not thousands of people killed. But the Iron Fist must be ideologically supported by something, right? Therefore, the new state religion, or should I say ideology, in this case it was difficult to separate religion from ideology, became Juche. What is it? Juche is a kind of thundering mixture of Marxism and Leninism, Korea's national beliefs, the cult of Kim's personality, and North Korean nationalism. Kim Il-sung himself described Juche as nothing more than Marxism-Leninism, adapted to the North Korean reality. This ideology was supposed to boost the morale of the ones who suffered from repression, poverty, and who actually lost the war. Besides, the integration of Juche would free North Korea from ideological dependence on the part of the Soviet Union and China. By the way, this was a common practice in the communist bloc of states. Vietnam, Cambodia, Yugoslavia, and even small but proud Albania created their own versions of twisted socialism to separate themselves from the total influence of Moscow or Beijing. But even with that in mind, neither the DPRK nor all the other states, of course, refused to accept any aid. The Soviet Union was dependent on its satellites, because if they stopped supporting them with money, resources, and technology, there is a possibility of these regimes simply collapsing sooner or later, meaning that the Americans can take their place there with democracy. Why does the USSR, for example, not annex all of these mooches then? The answer is quite simple. In 1953, Stalin had already died, and the foreign policy also changed a little to be less aggressive in deeds, but no less aggressive in words. Soon after the death of Joseph Vissarionovich, a de-Stalinization campaign launched in the USSR, which Kim didn't support, as did Mao in China. However, Kim was able to take advantage of this de-Stalinization, declaring those people who supported it inside North Korea to be the country's enemies, and thus getting rid of his own competitors. Well, of course, the introduction of Juche was proclaimed as the true or the only correct way to achieve communism, according to Lenin's wills. Older comrades in the person of Khrushchev have allegedly betrayed the said ideals. In addition, after the death of Stalin, relations between Soviet Union and China began to get more and more strained. But North Korea did not choose either of these sides, preferring to be on a more neutral position in the communist bloc. Instead, Kim battled with the Chinese faction within communist North Korea and tried to expel Chinese troops from his country in every way possible. In 1958, he finally succeeded, marking the complete independence of North Korea. But given the total economic state, it can be said that the land was independent in a special sense. In order to strengthen his political power, Kim created something of a caste system meant to divide the population into classes: the normal guys, the true followers of Juche, the waivers, and the enemy class. The most unenviable fate was prepared for the enemy class, which consisted of intellectuals, landowners who couldn't escape in time, as well as supporters of Japan. All suspicious individuals were of course added to the latter caste as a pretext for repression. They were resettled in the poorest parts of the country and were basically in a state of semi-slaves. If it wasn't sweet for the average Korean, imagine how it was for them. Aside from that, Kim Il-sung was able to establish relations with other countries of the communist bloc. He kept warmest relations with the Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, who was so inspired by Juche that during the construction of his cult of personality, he focused on his North Korean brothers under the communist banner. Also, being jealous of the success of the North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh, Kim thought that guerrilla warfare methods would help him unify Korea sooner or later. At that time, South Korea had already begun its economic boom. North Korean guerrillas carried out all kinds of subversive activities, kidnapped people, and so on. It came to the point that in 1968, the North Koreans attempted to kill the South Korean president Park Chung-hee. This day was written into the history books as the January 21st incident, which of course only made already strained relations between the two states even worse. In 1972, a new constitution was promulgated in North Korea. Now, the Prime Minister was not the Prime Minister, but the President, so Kim modestly refused the post of Prime Minister and was elected President. From 1980, he began to gradually prepare his son to succeed in the presidential chair. Towards the middle of the 80s, North Korea started to face more and more economic problems. Due to the fact that the Juche ideology itself was aimed at making them as self-sufficient as possible by providing it with both resources and goods, the country was still isolated from foreign trade and the outside world. Well, except for China and the USSR apparently. These guys were busy carrying out their own liberal reforms. China followed Deng Xiaoping's reforms and the USSR was undergoing the period of perestroika. The DPRK was catastrophically lagging behind its neighbors, in particular from South neighbors who, due to investments from the USA, reforms and adequate market policy, have already thrived compared to its backward neighbor from the North. China found the DPRK less and less interesting as an ally and partner, while as soon as the entire Eastern Bloc and the USSR were approaching the 90s, they were on the verge of a total collapse themselves. Help and infusions were nowhere to be found. The Hermit Kingdom actually remained in the 50s, isolated and still left with unfinished industrialization. Besides, Kim was obviously not getting any younger and was getting seriously ill from time to time. He developed a tumor. As far as I understand, it was benign, but he didn't dare to undergo surgery. Not because he was afraid of doctors and injections, but because he was afraid that his own subjects would simply kill him right on the operating table and carry out a coup. His paranoia about finding enemies has reached another level. In 1994, while still on his 2 feet, he began the development of a nuclear program in order to obtain nuclear weapons first, of course, and to protect himself from enemies and non-supporters, because in modern conventional warfare, he will most likely lose it all very quickly. And secondly, he needed the nuclear program in order to build nuclear power plants and finally to overcome the problem of lack of energy in the country, which didn't manage to provide rapid industrialization. As a result, through negotiations between the US and North Korea, Kim agreed to suspend the nuclear program. This was a victory for the civilized world, but already in July of 1994, he died as a result of a heart attack. Some may say that now, as with Mao's in China or Stalin's death, there will be a thaw, reforms and debunking of the leader's cult of personality, but nah, his son Kim Jong-il took his place. All sorts of statues, portraits of his father, and so on have already become commonplace in North Korea. Everyone was already used to the fact that he called himself a great leader, a heavenly leader, and even the sun-faced one. Publications and scientific works had to contain quotes of the great sun-faced Juche, even if the meaning of his quotes did not directly relate to the work's topic. In schools and universities, there were separate subjects dedicated to him and his biography. The great leader was praised for his life accomplishments through movies and cinema, By the way, this cinema was run by his son, Kim Jong-il. Think that such a cult of personality is enough? No, it's only got worse. Since his death, national mourning was declared for 3 years throughout the country, and everyone who somehow violated the rules of mourning was sent to prison or to hard labor. Also, the great leader was declared the eternal president, and the title remains with him to this day. For this reason, they even changed the constitution. Well, why even, you may ask? This is only a piece of paper, and the little things in life. Kim Jong-il. Alright, who was that son of the great leader who came to replace him? Who was Kim Jong-il? He was born in a camp near Khabarovsk under the name Yuri Ursanovich Kim, because at the time, his father Kim Il-sung, as you remember, retreated with his detachment from Korea and was in the territory of the Soviet Union for a while. Although his official biography states that he was born in a secret camp on Mount Baekdu, which is considered sacred in Korea, thus being connected to his land from the beginning of his life. Well, it's good that he was born, you know? They could have said that he came down from heaven or something, although it was not possible to make the new leader an actual god. The official biography also mentions that on the day of his birth, 2 rainbows appeared and a new shining star lit up in the sky, and because of this, his birthday remains as a North Korean holiday called Shining Star Day up to this day. Another very interesting point in his biography covers his studies, as it is officially said that he was educated in Pyongyang between 1950 and 1960. But as you remember, this coincides precisely with the Korean War, so some historians speculate that he most likely studied in China. But, as you already understood, a great leader's fate should be intertwined with Korea through and through, and how ironic that the first 2 Kims spent their youth and formation far from home and their own people. Of course, Kim Jong-il was a political genius throughout his early years, participating in various organizations, such as the Korean Children's Union or the Democratic Youth League of North Korea, and at the age of 15, he became the deputy chairman of this organization. Unfortunately, he cannot become the head of it, since you must be a teacher by education to reach the position this high. Kim Jong-il received his higher education at the university named after his father, but who really thought of this stuff when it was necessary to make a political career? In the summer of 1961, he officially joined the Workers' Party of Korea. Guess what? With the help of his father's connections, he rapidly began to climb the party career ladder. The so-called Kapsan faction incident seriously helped in his promotion. Back to North Korea state back then, as you remember, although the land was totally dominated by the Communist Party, several intra-party factions were also operating here and there. One of them was the Kapsan faction, made up of former guerrillas who fought against the Japanese, and after the creation of North Korea, they became a part of the guerrilla party led by Kim. Over time, though, it began to dissolve into a separate faction, and even went through several internal party purges. After 1966, the faction began to clash with Kim Il-sung for 2 reasons. The first was a total rejection of his economic policy, since they believed that Kim's idea of parallel development of the army and the economy was not very good for people, and in addition, they believed that instead of heavy industry, just like Stalin commanded, they instead must have developed consumer and light industry. But the most important reason was the second one. It was all about the succession, because at that time, Comrade Kim wanted to appoint his younger brother, Kim Yong-ju, but he was not very liked by this group, primarily because he didn't participate in the guerrilla liberation of Korea. Instead, they preferred their candidate Pak Kum-chol, not to mention them opposing the glorification of Kim's personality cult, which was just gaining momentum at that time. Kapsan members began to speak about Pak's ideas on a level with Kim's ideas, which was simply unacceptable, because there is only one leader, the same as God. Soon, Father Kim began to strike back, considering these movements as threats to his power. A great purge had begun. Pak Kum-chol was soon tried by one of Kim's supporters for spreading feudal and Confucian ideas, and for Park even, you can imagine, allowed himself to mock the great leader's slogan. He was eventually sent to a poor countryside part of North Korea, and we know nothing more about him. He was most likely killed there. Purges didn't end simply by imprisoning one of many leaders of this coup. Many members of the party were expelled to be either executed, driven to suicide, or mysteriously vanished later on, and those who were lucky enough were sent to camps as war prisoners. As we can see, in general, torturing people was definitely their forte. In fact, this was a very important streak of events because the growth of the personality cult only increased, and the son of Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, was able to stand out with his active part in the organization of this very purge. Since then, his father began to seriously consider him as a formidable heir. Kim Jong-il, despite his cruelty, was a big fan of American cinema, which, by the way, was banned in North Korea. But you can forgive your child, can't you? Aware of his kid's fascination, Kim Sr. appointed him to lead propaganda on the territory of North Korea, expecting Jong-il to strengthen his own cult of personality. And you know what? Kim Jr. did a pretty good, one might even say original job for achieving that. Why? As you probably guessed, there was a lack of talented directors in the not-so-free North Korea. Therefore, he decided to steal one of South Korea's most famous directors, Shin Sang-ok, and his wife too as a bonus. Apparently, as soon as they got to the DPRK, they were immediately brought to Kim Jong-il, who said that after filming the right movie, they would pay him $2.5 million. And just like that, Shin Sang-ok went on making propaganda movies for 5 whole years. But due to repeated attempts to escape, he still ended up in prison with no money paid for his work. Nevertheless, there is another version of this story that exists, which claims that they were immediately put behind bars for 4 years, where they were fed rice and engaged in ideological training. After that, they met with Kim Jong-il and agreed to shoot a bunch of movies. But as a result of 2 versions of history, Shin Sang-ok made a movie called The Communist Version of Godzilla, which Kim Jong-il liked very much, and could you imagine, allowed the director's family to go to Vienna to discuss the movie's distribution in Europe, which they took advantage of and fled to the US Embassy, where they received political asylum. Needless to say, Pulgasari was badly received at the global box office. The position of the chief's son as their heir was not stable. At some point, Kim Jong-il began to clash with his father's younger brother, who was an old-school communist, educated in the Soviet Union. He was kind of a Stalinist, who didn't really take these fictions about the Juche and his brother's cult of personality seriously. This was skillfully led by Kim Jong-il, and thanks to intrigues and manipulations, the guy managed to push his uncle away from the throne. Kim Jong-il did not give up trying to please his dad, and to firmly establish himself as the successor. Well, after all, we are talking about the DPRK adopting guerrilla warfare methods with South Korea, believing that it would help them to unite one day. All this led to the October 9, 1983 incident, when an attempt was made to assassinate the South Korean president Chun Doo-hwan in the capital of Burma, today's Myanmar, committed by 3 North Korean officers. Expectedly, South Korean authorities named Kim Jr. as the man behind the whole deal, who was not yet in power at the time. Under him, there were attempts to kill the South Korean president with explosives. As a result, 4 South Korean ministers and 17 other high-ranking officials and journalists got killed. The most important goal was not achieved though, because the president was saved by chance. His car got stuck in a traffic jam and he arrived a few minutes later. The international scandal was inevitable. Firstly, Burma authorities were not very happy about the explosion in its own capital, withdrawing from any diplomatic relations with North Korea. China, which seemed to be North Korea's ally, was also not very positive about the terrorist attack, boycotting diplomatic relations with its initiators for several months, as well as because of the bombing of Flight 858, also orchestrated by Kim Jong-il, as a result of which 115 people were killed, 113 were South Koreans, 2 were citizens of India and Lebanon. In 1994, North Korea was included in the list of state sponsors of terrorism. All these actions were meant to please his wonderful father and confirm his position as the heir. Among other things, he gradually began to rise through the military hierarchy without having served a single day in the army. Come on, the guy lived a luxurious life, eating lobsters and drinking only the most elite alcohol, with his favorite brand being Hennessy. The trickster also asserted his dad's and his own cult of personality, convincing more and more people about the divine nature in his family and establishing relations with the army men. It's also worth talking about the reasons why North Korea became what it is. Ever wondered why? It's all because Kim Sr. saw the experience of his Soviet and Chinese allies, realizing that if he wouldn't have an heir who would correspond to his ideas, then he and what he built would simply be forgotten in the sands of time, as it had happened with Stalin after his death, or with Mao, although a slightly different case happened with Comrade's sun-faced great helmsman. His cult of personality legacy was not forgotten, but all the state construction work as well as Mao's economic policy were rejected since China is no longer moving towards the path of communism. It seemed to many that Kim Jong-il would be a much weaker figure and would easily surrender his positions after his father's death. Even before coming to power, he already controlled the Korean People's Army as its supreme commander. At the same time, he had the defense minister of North Korea among his allies. So, after Kim Il-sung died due to a heart attack, there was no change in direction in domestic politics. After coming to power, the man became an actual mirror image of his own father. Fearing to be killed, he traveled only in a special armored train, as he considered airplanes and cars a convenient place to get killed. Of course, who but him must know where it's most convenient to kill political rivals. Due to the lack of personal charisma and a complex character, he tried to avoid big events. Kim Jr. was quite secluded in his childhood after the death of his brother, which had a huge impact on him, as well as the fact that up to 50 years old, he was in the state of a person who wants to achieve power, waiting for the death of his own father to finally occupy the throne, but idolizing him at the same time. This surely creates a lot of complexes. Paul I had something similar in the Russian Empire. He developed the habit of speaking quietly so often, even his subordinates didn't hear what he was saying, and few dared to question the son of the nation. Yep, that's his title. His titles are also a separate form of art. Here are 3 of my favorites. Ever victorious, iron-willed commander. Bright son of Juche, shining star of Baekdu Mountain. Sonny Boy's regime started off with hunger, since, as I've already said many times, economic problems began to arise in North Korea from the beginning of the 80s, and the dependence of the Juche followers on the Soviet Union was also clearly displayed. The reformation of the USSR's internal system began to gain momentum, and the aid to ideological brothers was slightly getting cut in less places, even demanding compensation for past assistance. Then, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, due to which in agriculture, as well as in the electricity market of the DPRK, big problems arose due to the sudden disappearance of its main patron. Luckily, Moscow was replaced by Beijing, which was able to cover Pyongyang's energy and food needs, while the country itself didn't have enough money to pay for it all, so China supplied resources at a discount or for free. Kim Jong-il gave quite decent sums to his supporters to strengthen his own power within the nation's borders, which meant that now Korea began to turn from a Soviet puppet into a Chinese one. Inside the country, though, talks were spreading about conducting an independent policy. But in 1993, even China started to face huge problems, drastically reducing their aid to North Korean friends. And don't you forget about droughts and floods, which lasted from 1995 to 1997. Because of the weather, there were problems with electricity. Many unique mines and hydroelectric power stations were simply flooded. Therefore, electricity production fell by 85%. I'd like to remind you that it was not in the best condition all along, not ready to cover even the bare minimum needs even before bad stuff happened. On top of that, a recently introduced system of food redistribution didn't work at all and couldn't provide food for the population. Food was distributed very selectively, so the amount of food you would receive solely depended on your social status and your loyalty to the state. What's more, as you've probably guessed, the elites also gave priority to the army, since the North Korean dictator understood that his position directly depends on them. The army was also malnourished, but still comparatively less so than the rest of society. As a result, the situation escalated into a humanitarian disaster, as a result of which child mortality and morbidity has increased among the population due to a lack of vitamins. The famine itself lasted from 1994 to 1998, leading to the deaths of 250,000 to 3.5 million people. Such a difference between the smallest and the largest figure is caused by a lack of information on the matter. International organizations and neighboring states helped to put this very problem to an end. In particular, the hated South Korea became arguably the largest donor of food to its North Korean counterpart, along with China, and also help from the United States and all kinds of religious organizations, which sounds very ironic to me personally. Anyway, international organizations had doubts on products reaching the local population due to the fact that North Korean authorities forbade representatives of said organizations to come on its territory. and this gap was used as an advantage by corrupt officials who took the products and sold them abroad at a low price. In North Korea, there are very serious issues with food still to this day. Although Comrade Kim Jong-il lived a luxurious life, drinking his favorite Hennessy and munching on lobsters all along the way, he was growing more and more paranoid. Just listen. The number of people repressed for political reasons reached 200,000 in 2004. Kim was very afraid of going abroad, fearing that he would just be killed there. The only countries he paid official visits to were Russia and China, and when he went to Moscow, he did so in his armored train, which took him more than a week to travel. And that's not the end of it. This visit was made on the condition that there would be no passengers on the platform, where he would leave the vehicle. In the 2000s, there were still attempts to squeeze out something from North Korea's economy, following the example of China, but in the end it didn't work out very well, because the ideology of total power of the Kim dynasty and the free market opportunities are not very compatible in practice. To make things more unsettling, in 2006, the dream of any dictator came true. North Korea got nuclear weapons, which are now a guarantee of their unlimited power, with Pakistan emerging as another ally of theirs. The latter developed their own nuclear weapons a little earlier and were actively selling them in the 90s, most notably to Libya's well-known leader, Muammar Gaddafi. Now it's a matter of general concern, since the DPRK conducts its foreign policy quite aggressively through constant testing of carriers and nuclear weapons, indeed threatening the South Koreans and the Japanese. In 2008, rumors began to emerge about the deterioration of the sun-lighted Kim Jong-il's health, caused by constant overeating, which he of course tried to tackle, but without success. Alcohol problems and some documents from WikiLeaks confirm him having epilepsy, but unfortunately we cannot judge their accuracy. What was known for sure is that his health was deteriorating. Overall, the Western press constantly mentioned the fact of his power getting weakened. In response to this, North Korea began to negotiate nuclear weapons usage on higher tones, and also released several videos where Comrade Kim held meetings, inspected production, and all sorts of other things. All this propaganda may have worked for an external audience, but a successor still had to be found, because Kim's time was running out. Kim Jong-un. 3 of the great Juche's sons were considered to take their place in the throne, with the main contender being his firstborn Kim Jong-nam. Like his old man, he was educated in Moscow and Switzerland and was fond of cinema and even made a bunch of his own short films, after which he received a managerial position in one of the North Korean ministries. At that point in time, everyone thought he would be the main pick after his father's death. However, in 2001, he was caught at Japan's international airport with a forged passport and then deported to China. He himself stated that he just wanted to fulfill his dream of visiting the Japanese Disneyland. The Japanese intelligence services published data revealing that this was far from his first visit to Japan, and his previous visits showed no signs for an upcoming visit to Disneyland, but for gambling and other bourgeois entertainment. Needless to say, the guy fell out of favor with his father and decided to travel to Macau, the Chinese Las Vegas. He later told how he wanted to carry out market reforms in the DPRK, explaining why he was removed from power with such unique ideas. In 2017, he was killed via poison at an international airport in Malaysia. This was far from the first attempt on his life. For example, in 2006, they tried to kill him already at the Budapest airport. After the self-removal of his eldest son, Kim Jong-il had to choose between the remaining 2 sons, Kim Jong-un and Kim Jong-chul. As you know by now, he decided to bet on the youngest Kim Jong-un, all because of Jong-chul's character, who according to the elder Kim, was too soft to rule a country. Therefore, the main contender for the North Korean throne, Kim Jong-un, left Switzerland without finishing his studies to gain experience and establish his authority inside the country. Thus, he began to prepare himself to become the brightest son of them all. It is worth noting that he was interested in quite ordinary stuff associated with Western teenagers, like basketball, American movies, and other delights of late decaying capitalism. And in fact, after the death of Kim Sr., as a result of a stroke in 2011, everyone was expecting a much softer and perhaps even a liberal leader would come to power. Unfortunately, what didn't happen after the death of Kim Il-sung also didn't happen after the death of Kim Jong-il either. As usual, the successor needed to concentrate power first due to the fact that he was only 28 years old at the time. He was practically a child who had just taken the huge responsibility as ruler of a modern country. So it was believed that his uncle would call the shot instead. But as soon as he began to fight for power and gathered all the people loyal to him in the party elite and military hierarchy, he proceeded to arrest his own uncle at one of the sports competitions, securing his place for reaching full power. Then, some heads went on flying, in some cases literally, like a bunch of generals who were not showing enough loyalty to him. Kim III put his men in their place. He started with the army aspect, because in North Korea, it was always the key for a complete control over the country. Both his father and he himself understood that. Then we had mass arrests, public executions, and other fun activities. This was done in order to build a reputation for himself as a ruthless individual, against whom people would have less desire to rebel, and also so that no one would think that because of his age he could somehow be manipulated or even overthrown. His power was finally established by 2014. In 2016, he began to change the balance of power in North Korea, replacing the National Defense Commission of the DPRK with the State Affairs Commission. The former was actually the main body on the territory of North Korea. Now, the number of soldiers there was qualitatively smaller, since he understood that this was an important force he and his father used and that they could be used by someone else. In 2019, he amended the constitution points, clarifying that the purpose of the army is to protect the government he headed. Besides, he qualitatively changed his image, trying to distance himself from his father in every possible way. He made a public appearance, met with ordinary citizens, well, at least on camera, and you understand what ordinary citizens could be seen with Comrade Kim, only verified agents no less. Again, he often took pictures with ordinary people, starred in some propaganda videos, rode roller coasters, and even worked in the garden. Well, I hope you do understand how real and genuine the garden is. All that was done to build his own brand new cult of personality, which he tried to avoid any resemblance from his more gloomy father and get a little closer to his grandfather, who is perceived much more warmly among the people. Even their hairstyles are practically the same. By the way, about hairstyles, he prohibited them, or rather limited them. At the legislative level, only a few options for men's and women's hairstyles are allowed. Well, don't be fooled by his image of a funny chubby dictator, because he's a monster. By the way, he is considered to be possibly the fattest person in North Korea, due to the fact that most people simply don't have enough food to get this fat. In fact, he is a cynical and very cruel person to deal with. Just remember his own arrested uncle. He was executed afterwards. Some of his relatives were executed too. The same fate was delivered to people not too inclined towards his beliefs. Torture and other attributes of totalitarian regimes haven't gone anywhere, despite Kim's modern look. Believe it or not, his economic policy turned out to be as successful as it can be in a communist totalitarian state. He is trying to somehow loosen the centralized management of all production in North Korea, giving a little freedom to distribution places. He is even trying to solve the lack of food, although still not doing it well so far. The culture of consumption and even entertainment is actively promoted in North Korea. Even a small business appeared, so not everything is now produced and sold exclusively by the government. But all mentioned pros are so insignificant and not impactful towards the lives of ordinary Koreans. It's even sadder than it ever was. Korea under Un is not so different from the Korea of his ancestors. Still the same centralized government, still the same centralized economy, and threats to the world with nuclear weapons. What is the history of the Kim dynasty all about? In my opinion, it speaks at different times about different things, about the nature of power, which is still based on total violence. It's also about hypocrisy, when you yourself are satisfied with Western movies, food and other things, but at the same time, forbid your own people to enjoy the same things. And the most important aspect is the desire to remain on the throne of power at any cost. Well, this is a prominent example of a country where nothing changed for the better after the death of its main leader. Everything could take an even worse turn. The cult of personality was renewed and supplemented. Statues and pedestals in Korea only aggravate, but the country still feels stuck in the 50s. The change of eras is reminded only by a very rare change of faces on campaign posters and banners. If you enjoyed this video, then we will go on to making more biographies of famous dictators. Hussein, for example, or Gaddafi are good candidates for the next episodes. If you want someone else to take the scene, write your option in the comments below. Don't forget to give us a like and subscribe. Take care, and see you in the next video.